so honored to have Director Banville join us today to facilitate an incredibly timely conversation in Montana politics and elections and voting law. A little bit about Director Banville. He joined the University of Montana in 2009 following 13 years at PBS NewsHour, where he was the editor-in-chief of the online NewsHour. With a background in web and digital reporting and social media, Director Banville teaches courses that include digital and web reporting, audience engagement, and the school's introductory media history and literacy course. He also teaches media law with a focus on access and open meeting laws, and co-teaches election reporting every 2 years. He is the author of Debating Our Destiny, Presidential Debate Moments That Shaped History, written in 2012 and updated in 2013. He's also authored a 2-volume encyclopedia covering American politics in the 21st century, an encyclopedia of news media titans, trends, and controversies, published in 2017. Self-described as a, quote, port fly fisherman, mediocre curler, and for some reason, the teacher of the largest classes of the School of Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Director Lee Banville to the School of Law, and enjoy the rest of our symposium.
Director Banville, we're just having a quick audio issue. I apologize. We gotta get this worked out.
Everybody keeps calling me Director Banville, and that seems weird.
Lee, we're having a problem.
Okay, there we go. I'm good with that. This makes me feel better about my 2 years of teaching via Zoom when other people struggle too, because this was me every class.
Okay, can we get a quick audio, Professor Siefter?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry that I missed whatever the introduction was, but I can hear you now.
Okay, I think we're good.
Yes, thank you, Professor Siefter. They were just talking about how I curl, which is the only really interesting fact about it. But I want to welcome our panelists and just give a little bit of background about how I hope to run this panel. You'll be so sad has been reduced by 15 minutes, but yeah, you're still going to get a lot out of it. The way I'd like to do this is more conversational. Because I'm a journalist and I used to work for Jim Lair, and so I think moderating, that's what you're supposed to do. And so the way we'll structure this is really more conversational. So if you do have questions during the panel, just raise your hand and I'll be sort of mixing those questions in while we're also having sort of a Q&A up here as opposed to more formal presentations. Although, frankly, these 3 panelists could each give incredibly important and insightful sort of presentations about the issues that we're going to be talking about in this panel. Because, well, I'll give a brief introduction of each of them. I'll start with our visitor from afar, who's zooming in. Miriam Siefter is an associate professor at the Wisconsin School of Law, which you see in the program. She's also the co-director of a new state democracy research initiative that really does look at these issues state by state, so she'll be able to offer enormous insight into the breadth of what's going on throughout other states as well as here in Montana. And at some point I would like to talk to Professor Siefter about being both the 2017 and 2022 Classroom Teacher of the Year chosen by the students. I don't know what that's like, and so I would like to chat with you about that at some point. Next is Yael Bromberg, who is the Chief Counsel for Voting Rights at the Andrew Goodman Foundation. She's also a lecturer at her alma mater, Rutgers Law, and author of a recent work at the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, Youth Voting Rights and the Unfulfilled Promise of the 26th Amendment. And so she has also published both academically and in the mass media, which I was like, talking about the issues of access to voting, both for youth but also for all participants. And last but certainly not least is the returning University of Montana Law Review editor, Lars Phillips, who is now an associate at Crowley Fleck, and has worked as one of the counsel in the Jacobson case that is currently pending in Billings. And so the idea here is to sort of structure this as a look at where we started in the terms of the Montana Constitution and youth voting, but also access to the ballot. Then to take a look at the issues that are going on now, and then just broaden the conversation out to what's happening nationwide. So to kind of start with, how did we get here? I think there's really no, well, I mean, literally, let's hear from the expert. Yael Bromberg was one of the expert witnesses in the Jacobson suit, and prepared an expert report on how we got. She has read more minutes of the Montana Constitutional Convention. I think, well, actually, I shouldn't say that in this room. So she's read a lot of it, though. And so I think, let me introduce Professor Bromberg and let her talk a little bit about how we got where we are now.
Pleasure and an honor to be joining you all today. It's my first official trip to Montana, so very nice to see this beautiful state and join this law review. And I want to thank the law review editors for doing such a wonderful job putting this tremendous program together. I'd just like to zoom out a little bit and provide a bit of an overview of the evolution of the right to vote. And if we speak about it federally, and then taking a cue from our prior keynote, allow us to zoom in on the state context, I think it allows us to further appreciate the state constitutional rights and this particular state's constitutional history, and also allow for this kind of national setting and framework, particularly when we're talking about voting rights at large and voter participation at large, including among young voters. We saw untold and unseen rates of voter participation nationally in the 2020 election, largely due to innovations and common sense responses to the pandemic with election modernization. And we saw the same trend apply also to increase and bolster the youth vote specifically. I'm going to ask the law review editors, maybe Blake, if you can put on the screen the first PowerPoint, please. Maybe as that kind of gets teed up, I'll offer a little bit of this overview. So I usually just jump to assume that people know what the 26th Amendment is, and I've learned to provide the text before we begin. The 26th Amendment was ratified in 1971 into the U.S. Constitution. Some folks that are around today are here, obviously, we're all here, obviously, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of ratification of the Montana State Constitution. That process took place on the heels of another 50th anniversary that we just celebrated, which was the 50th anniversary of the ratification of the 26th Amendment. There's a reason that folks don't know what the 26th Amendment is, and it's largely because it's been escaped from public discourse. Thank you. It's been escaped from public discourse and has been underutilized and underappreciated by the judiciary and also by the general public. And the 26th Amendment, what it did specifically was lower the voting age to 18 and forbid abridgment of the right to vote on account of age, just like the 19th Amendment did on account of sex. The 26th Amendment was on account of age. And so that we can appreciate this evolution of the right to vote, we had the nation's first Reconstruction following the Civil War, when we ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to abolish slavery, expand access to equal rights under law, and forbid discrimination on account of race, color, and servitude. That's generally known as the first Reconstruction. It's the process by which the nation came together as a form of healing and reconciliation to expand democracy and ensure peace in the nation. And the second Reconstruction really took place, this is Professor Van Woodward, who's an expert on Southern history, and he coined the term the Second Reconstruction, which is generally known as having started in 1954, following the United States Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Ed, overturning the principle that separate is equal, and expanding, as Professor Woodward has identified, to 1967. And that was the time period between 1954 and 1967, following the World War, when the nation again came together for the purpose of democracy and peace to expand new constitutional rights and manifest the promises and the reality of prior constitutional rights that had been ratified but had yet to be guaranteed. And so the 26th Amendment comes on the heels of what is considered the Second Reconstruction. I articulate in my law review article that it's a natural consequence of the nation's Second Reconstruction, and it was ratified in 1971. And what happened was that the nation came together through the Senate unanimously and through the House with a strong supermajority to send through Congress and the states this proposal to lower the voting age and ban age discrimination when it comes to access to the ballot. The purpose of this slide is really to lay out the chronology, not for getting lost in the text, but simply for understanding that these are discrete moments and eras in U.S. history when new rights have been ratified, and ones that had been previously ratified were then further constitutionalized through federal statute to be guaranteed. So, for example, we had the 24th Amendment ratified in 1964, right to vote free of poll tax, following Supreme Court jurisprudence which established that right, but this allowed for it to be further constitutionalized. And thereafter we had Congress responding to this crisis that was taking place across the states. And in response to the prior keynote, there was a serious crisis throughout the states. And so we had this federal response by way of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 1968. And prior to the ratification of the 26th Amendment, we also had the introduction of the Voting Rights Amendment Act of 1970. I know I'm giving you a lot, but I want to provide a context for Montana's unique history in this federal evolution of the right to vote, and the way in which Montana enfranchised and expanded these rights within the state constitution itself. And when we focus on youth vote, it simply allows us an opportunity to enter that discussion, not just for young voters, but for voters at large. So the Voting Rights Amendment Act of 1970, commonly known as, a section of that was commonly known as Title III. Another name for that was the Mansfield Amendment, and Senate Majority Mike Mansfield, who's the longest serving Senate majority in U.S. history, as you all very likely know, was a celebrated hero politician in Montana. And I have spent a lot of time interviewing and speaking with, and spending a lot of time in the Library of Congress, in the archives, looking at the history of the 26th Amendment, and speaking with the chief aides to the main U.S. representatives at the time who ushered through ratification of the 26th. One of them is a gentleman named Jason Berman, who served as chief aide to Senator Birchby, who chaired the Senate subcommittee on judiciary amendments, which is the main place that housed all of the amendments that were coming out of this era, including the introduction of what you'll see later was the Electoral College and the Equal Rights Act and other areas of federal constitutional rights. And Jay Berman tells me when I speak with him that Senator Mike Mansfield is the unsung hero of the 26th Amendment. And there's really good reason for that, because even though the 26th had been introduced over 150 times in the 30-year history to Congress, it was only through Mansfield's acumen and just grace that it actually manifested and became included within the federal Constitution. Specifically, he introduced the Mansfield Amendment through the 1970 Voting Rights Amendment Act to try a statutory route. And he introduced it. It was widely and well received. It was included within the Voting Rights Act thereafter. And it became a leverage plus, and for state and local elections, 21 plus. That is how Senator Mansfield helped to create this political leverage after this proposal having been introduced over 150 times in 30-year history for all of these different levers. The Supreme Court, Congress, House states, and circulated throughout the states, the requisite 38 states in record time, making the 26th Amendment the fastest amendment to be ratified in United States history by huge cross-partisan. Partisanship was really not even a part of it. It was nearly unanimous. So, aside from Senator Mansfield's, Senate Majority Leader's Mansfield's participation in this, how does this apply to the Montana State Constitutional Convention? If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay. I propose this also not to get lost in the text, but to provide an overview, a visual aid for the general chronology, also so I don't have to read all of this to you. So, of course, at the top, we see the Montana Constitution in 1889, slightly after the nation's first Reconstruction, which I spoke about earlier. And then we saw subsequent introductions of efforts to lower the voting age in the Montana legislature through 1947 and really until 1972. And these are the various proposals that were introduced into the Montana state legislature at the time. You can see that they largely track with World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, because the question about expanding the right to young people was really crystallized because young people were dying at untold rates during the Vietnam War. But also, young people were really leaders of the nation's second Reconstruction and a point of interest also during the nation's first Reconstruction. If you look at the nation's founders, some of them had been teenagers fighting, and many of them were extremely young when they were participating in the nation's debate for federal constitutional rights. And I have an article, as was pointed out in Teen Vote, which really talks about the state leaders, federal and state leaders and their ages when they were participating in these discussions, because I think it's so easy to look at young people as a class and say, oh, you're disaffected, you're not interested, et cetera, et cetera. But actually that's counterpoint to national history, which was largely, not uniformly, however, largely shaped and created by young people participating in the democratic process. Going back to Montana specifically, Montana proposed lowering the, I'm sorry, can you go to the last one? Somehow it's switched over, thank you. Expanding the right to vote to young people 4 times. And it was 8th in the nation of having done so before even ratification of the federal right. So it was leading not only through state proposals submitted to the voters in 1970 and 1972, but also when it ratified the 26th Amendment only a week after it was sent by Congress to the states for ratification, and it fought for that to be among the first in the nation to embrace the 26th Amendment. There's actually really interesting letters between Senate Majority Leader Mansfield and the governor at the time, Governor Anderson, talking about this, talking about the federal right, the state right, etc. And going through the state constitutional convention transcript, you actually see this, there's just an assumption, there's a recognition. The federal constitution has been ratified on the 26th Amendment ground. We're embracing that right within the state constitution. And very interestingly, we're expanding upon it within the state constitution beyond just what the federal had just ratified. And I think that the point here that I also just want to hit home for us is that in 1971, Montana ratifies the 26th Amendment only a week after it was sent when they in turn ratified the Montana State Constitutional Proposal as well. So again, just for the visual overview, we have several sections within Article 2 Declaration of Rights within the Montana State Constitution, including suffrage, a robust anti-discrimination provision, which is actually much more expansive than under federal law, general popular sovereignty, which is fairly common, we see that often. And then there's two sections, there's Section 14 and Section 15. In Section 14, there's a recognition of the expansion of adult rights to those 18 and older, so there's a demarcation around the age of 18, which, by the way, is historical. It's when they thought that men were strong enough to wear armor. So there was, again, this connection between military participation and expansion of the right. And then this interesting section within Section 15, which is rights of persons under the age of majority being 18. The rights of persons under 18 years of age shall include, but not be limited to, all the fundamental rights of this article, so all of the fundamental rights above, popular sovereignty, equal protection, anti-discrimination, suffrage, adult rights to those 18 plus, all of those can be included within Section 15 for those under the age of 18, unless specifically precluded by laws which enhance the protection of such persons. What that means is, drinking age, for example, driving age, etc., that there can only be restrictions on youth enfranchisement, and not just youth enfranchisement, youth rights, if it is for their benefit and their enhancement. And I want to focus on that because this is actually very unique in the way that it's phrased. It was also very prescient because later, for example, we had discussions in the state and federal courts, recognition that young people, for example, cannot serve lifetime in prison, cannot be criminally executed, etc. Because there was a recognition that when you're young, there's a certain different understanding of what your ability is, your cognition is. And now we have developmental science, which recognizes this idea of hot and cold cognition in terms of your ability to execute rights. So you have an ability as a young person to understand developmentally ideas that are not reactionary in the current moment, ideas that you can decide and deliberate on, that young people are able to make those types of decisions. They can execute what's considered cold cognition, whereas their hot cognition runs a bit differently, and that's where you get the automatic response, the automatic reaction. And criminal law has understood that as well. So I think I'm going to cut it off there, but I think the main takeaway here, and I needed to provide you these visual aids, because otherwise it's just way too much information to try to have to articulate, to acknowledge that the Montana State Constitution did something really remarkable that I have not seen happen in other state constitutions, which is embrace, it was the second state constitutional convention to take place after ratification of the 26th Amendment, and was very intentional in expanding and embracing the rights of the 26th Amendment, the other areas of federal protection of rights. There are many other articles, as I showed you earlier, which there was a robust conversation during the convention about embracing them, and also very deliberate on expanding of those rights within the state constitution itself.
So with that as a backdrop, I kind of want to turn the corner towards, so we understand now a bit more well, at least I do, about the source of the voting rights provisions both in the Montana State Constitution and obviously the federal Constitution. But obviously having rights does not always equal, there's always limits to rights, right? You have a First Amendment right, but there are reasonable limits that can be placed on the state based on, time, place, and manner. And so, I want to kind of turn to Lars now and talk about how do we operationalize the rights that Ms. Bromberg has outlined. How do we kind of find that right balance? And this is the thing that obviously the lawsuit that's ongoing now is, I was going to tell you what's in it, but I feel like this is an audience that probably knows what's in the right that's in the articles of the Montana Constitution and turn it into policy? And what are the challenges that we've seen faced by both the Secretary of State and then obviously clerks of elections around the state? Just kind of lay out a little bit about what this looks like here in Montana now.
Sure. So I'm going to stay seated. My wife and I just welcomed our first child about 3 weeks ago, so due to sheer exhaustion, but thank you, Director. I think there are three sort of principal ideas that we can start with as the baseline. First is that high voter turnout is good for democracy. Participation in our government is good for democracy. The second is that every election regulation, to some extent, burdens the right to vote. What that means is we hold our elections generally on Tuesday, and holding them on a Tuesday burdens the right to vote. Some people have to work. We close the polls generally at 8 p.m. That burdens the right to vote for those people that can't make it in time. So we have this idea that, and I think it's fairly accurate to say that every voting regulation burdens to some extent the right to vote. And then we have this third piece, which is the administration of elections, particularly in Montana, is something that I think flies under the radar for most folks. We've got 56 counties. I grew up in Lewistown, out in Rutgers County, and we have this disparity between not only population, but funding, and simply staffing that kind of really shows up in the context specifically of elections. So for example, Missoula County recently has a great new several $7 million election center. And that's fantastic because the population of the Missoula County Clerk and Recorder needs to service when it comes to elections. Fergus County, like where I'm from, they simply don't have those same resources. So we've got these three kind of ideas. One, we want higher turnout. Two, every voting regulation is going to burden the right to vote to some degree. And three, we have to set regulations on our elections in order to administer them in a fair, safe, and accurate manner. The next piece, before we get into maybe how these elections function, I think is to move to Montana's Constitution. And as Yael said, and as Justice Nelson talked about last night, there are several provisions that implicate to some extent the right to vote. And from my perspective, that is the sort of new and novel question that's being posed to the Montana Supreme Court, or will be posed to the Montana Supreme Court and the District Court in these currently pending election lawsuits. And that is, what is the right to vote under Montana's Constitution? So we have Article 2, Section 13 that protects the free exercise. It says no power, civil or military may interfere. But we also have Article 4, Section 2 that says the right to vote is granted to those individuals who meet the registration and residency requirements as provided by law. This as provided by law language starts to come up again and again, and I'm sure people in this room have seen Montana's Constitution is being interpreted at a breakneck pace. I think in the last 3 years we have seen decisions, it feels like every month, if not more frequently, talking about very critical issues. And so we move on to the next section, which is Article 4, Section 3. And that says that the legislature shall, it's a mandatory obligation, provide by law the requirements for residency, registration, absentee voting, and administration of elections. So they are obligated to pass these laws to sort of create the structure for our elections, and that has led the Supreme Court to recognize that elections generally are a matter of statutory law. Article 4 also contains a second provision, which I think is particularly interesting, and it says that the legislature may provide for a system of poll booth registration and shall ensure the purity of elections and guard against the abuses of the electoral process. And so what the District Court and Supreme Court are being asked in various becomes, in my opinion, a really extraordinary exercise. My friend Alex Rixley, the audience right there, as counsel for some plaintiffs group, and I think both he and I could probably sit down together and talk about this thing for several hours and have completely different interpretations and probably have what we think are very good reasons for those. But I think what we're seeing now in Montana, and why I was so thankful to have the opportunity to participate in this panel, and as a former law review member myself, it is a little odd. I remember how much work went into putting this on, so thank you guys again for your efforts. But I was especially struck by Judge Sutton's comments this morning about judicial review. And I think there's an idea out there that we are, I think it's fair to say, seeing an increased scrutiny of both our judges, our court administrators, our government. I think that we're in a hyper-politicized environment. And the reason that comes up, from my perspective, in these election cases is the exercise of judicial review over these questions that are being posed, and I think it is, in my opinion, fair to say that when the greater the exercise of judicial review, the more scrutiny becomes applied to the judicial selection process. As you all know, we have current election, or this election will decide one of the seats in the Montana Supreme Court is an absolutely critical election. And I think to demonstrate what, this exercise of judicial review and how that can really bring questions before the court.
Okay.
So there's this case that was decided, just a really brief case study, just recently, about whether we should elect our Montana Supreme Court justices by district. And if you followed that case, you knew, I think, from the outset that the Montana Supreme Court had already pretty much decided that question. They decided back in this case called Rutgers in 2012. But there was a new law that was passed, and so there was an effort, again, to make that happen. And what we saw when it came before the Montana Supreme Court was a dissenting opinion by Justice Beth Baker and Justice Jim Rice that touched on this idea that they were exercising judicial review of a law that had not been passed because the actual bill at issue placed that question to the voters. And so they're exercising judicial review of the law prior to its enactment, prior to the voters having this ability to comment on it. And both of those justices made the point that the more that we exercise this judicial review, the more we take away from, I think, the ability of the voters to say what they need to say. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We are familiar generally with the BIPA case, because it's referred. A couple of years ago, it was this idea about ballot collection in Montana, and it was struck down as unconstitutional. And the idea that we need our courts to be there to say that, this is an absolutely unconstitutional infringement on the right to vote in Montana. However, at the same time, that BIPA legislative referendum was passed by 60% of the voters in Montana. And so we've got a little bit of an issue. We have a contest between this, majoritarian, will and this court as a staunch defender of our constitutional rights. And I think that's kind of where I'd like to end, but.
Yeah, well, no, I think there are a couple points there that, that sort of three-pronged reality of that any rules around voting suppress some form of voting, right? Or at least have the potential to suppress some form of voting. All of these conversations that were happening at a time when Professor Siefter because I'm going to actually quote her to her, which I hope she's okay with. A recent article she wrote says that American democracy faces many threats. Some, like political violence that targets elections, directly attack the rule of law. Yet one insidious possibility is that election subversion will come from within the legal system, not outside it. And that it will co-opt the vocabulary and instruments of law, not reject them outright. And I guess, Professor Siefter, if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, you don't have to dive specifically into what's happening in Montana, but I think there's this question of when is an election regulation an honest effort to run effective, clean, fair, safe elections? And when does it have the potential to become what you're talking about here, a sort of an instrument to systematically disenfranchise or systematically alter the sort of electoral reality? Like, how do we know, how can we tell, when an election rule is, an honest effort, and when is it a politicized, act of evil?
Thank you for the question. So first of all, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, can I get a thumbs up or something? Okay, great. So thank you so much for including me in this event. I'm really grateful to Blake and the Law Review editors for wonderful organization and patience, and I'm just gutted that I'm not there in person. I was really looking forward to the trip, but it's probably, this one was not the occasion, so I hope there's a future occasion. So, as a way of answering that question, I think it's helpful to zoom out a little bit. So I'm actually going to put up a slide. You guys can let me know if this is successful. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
It's like, you can? I can see it. Okay, so the one way to think about sort of where states sit and where state courts sit vis-a-vis some of the types of threats that I wrote about and that was just asked about is to think about how state constitutions treat democracy in the first place. Building on a little bit what Judge Sutton started by saying, the federal constitution is many things, but it is not through and through designed to be a document of democracy. And you can see that, in some of the institutions that we have, each of which in various ways is not a direct translation of the will of the people. And we can see that, as Judge Sutton was talking about in more detail, through the Constitution's own amendment process, which is extremely difficult to pull off. That's one way of thinking about constitutions. I think for some of us, and especially in law school, it becomes our frame of reference for what a constitution is. It's this sort of entrenched document that, sort of makes self-government difficult for certain reasons that, we could all debate whether those are the right reasons or not. But one of the things that I have explored in my work is that state constitutions are just different in their relationship to democracy. They are very much documents that are founded around popular sovereignty, majority rule, and political equality. And I put up here a law review article that I've written that's sort of the foundation for the quote you heard and some of my other writing. And so, one way to think about why this would be, and it's actually funny that I think all three of us have invoked these provisions of the Montana Constitution. So let me just show you how common those provisions are, that this is really something we can think about as a state constitutional commitment nationwide. So 49 states feature a popular sovereignty provision, or a declaration that all power resides in the people. Every state expressly protects the right to vote, with many including additional guarantees, like we've been talking about, and including that elections must remain free and equal or free and open. State constitutions established the direct election of far more officials, with no equivalent of electoral college or U.S. Senate. And we can also talk about, of course, as Lars was referring to, the structure of the state courts. Roughly half of the states, of course, including Montana, provide opportunities for direct democracy as a means of enacting or vetoing statutes or amending the Constitution. And then there's the state constitutional amendment itself, which is far easier than the federal counterpart, allowing people to be actually the authors of their government in a meaningful way on an ongoing basis. So before I turn to Montana, these are some examples from other states of the kinds of provisions I just mentioned. So Pennsylvania, a popular sovereignty clause, providing again that all power is inherent to the people. From Washington State, an example of a requirement that elections be free and equal. And from Arkansas, an example of a reservation of the initiative power. Now, when it comes to Montana, I'm really mostly here to listen and learn, but I would say that to read your Constitution is really to be impressed by its democratic commitments. So these are just a few of the examples I pulled, which overlap with what some of the other speakers have focused on. But popular sovereignty and self-government, rights of participation and of suffrage, and then some of these other structural features that I was just talking about, initiative and referendum, ways that can structure and limit the power of the legislature, the executive and the provision of direct election of multiple different executive officials, and then of course the constitutional revision itself. In terms of the original question, so how do we cash this out, right? How does this provision apply in any given case? I think that if there were really, really easy answers to that, and sometimes there are, right? But if there were really easy answers to that, then a lot of what's going on in the world would be simpler. So there certainly can be hard cases, and our work, we don't deny that, and that's part of something that Chief Judge Sutton was talking about as well, part of what courts have to grapple with. But there are a number of interesting examples where it seems like the democracy principle does provide an answer and does suggest that something is the right answer or the wrong answer. Let me just weigh in on a couple, and then I want to be sure to not talk forever and have more of a conversation. So you all are the experts, of course, on voting rights litigation we've been talking about. But I take it that one of the questions in that case is whether Montana should apply its own test for determining the types of burdens that are placed on the right to vote, or whether it should lockstep with federal law and apply the Anderson verdict test. That seems like the kind of question where both the democracy principle and just an appreciation of state constitutional law, as Judge Sutton was talking about, provide the answer, right? That the Montana Constitution has a different relationship with democracy, and that Montana's own test would be the more appropriate choice. There are other possible applications. The case about judicial districting that Lars was mentioning also seems like a relevant democracy principle case in the sense that it would have taken statewide decision-making in some sense away from a statewide body, or would have transformed the selection of that body to make it less majoritarian in terms of the people of the state. And there's other recent applications of this principle in other states, and I'm happy to talk about them, that deal with ballot initiative burdens. So I don't know if you're familiar with a recent case from Idaho, nearby, striking down a statute that would have made it much more difficult, if not impossible, to get ballot initiatives qualified for the ballot. I know that there's been some developments in Montana, at least in terms of legislation. That's another sort of type of decision where you can ask whether the democracy principle is in play. So I don't think I fully answered the question, but I'm happy to keep the conversation going. But let me stop there and see if others want to weigh in or if there are other questions.
Well, do you guys want to follow up on any of the things that were brought up by the other speakers before I keep asking the questions I'm curious about? Okay, all right, then I get to ask the questions I'm curious about. So I also want to talk about Judge Sutton, because otherwise not everyone will mention him. But he talked about how, obviously, and it was interesting to think about that the fact that state judges are elected, or at least 90% of state judges are elected, and that the state constitutions are more sort of democratic, and they're more easily amended, more easily adapted to what's happening in society. And I'm curious, is there danger in this at all, right, of the state court? So I think there's a sort of gorilla in the room of, we have an election going on to the state Supreme Court that has become incredibly politicized to a degree that we've never seen in Montana. At least, I shouldn't say never. In recent history, we have never seen. I always have to caveat. And whenever a journalist writes, always, never, I'm like, that's probably wrong. And so, does that change this conversation? Does that, if elections to courts become partisan acts, not not political acts, but partisan acts, does that alter what Judge Sutton or others talk about? You know, as we talk about the enfranchisement of voters to choose their judges, you know, if it becomes a partisan act, does that alter it? Well, I'm just going to stop. Does that alter it? That's my question.
I'm really happy that you asked the question, because the same thought occurred to me when I was listening to the keynote earlier, which is that there's only so far that a certain kind of ideological approach can take us until we analyze what the practical outcome of that, right? So I appreciate a lot of the concepts and the rights, as I discussed earlier, that Montana incorporated and expanded on the federal right as a process of state constitutionalism. And I actually appreciated the prior comments from the keynote that seemed maybe explicit or impliedly to be critical of the Citizens United decision, actually expressly critical of it, particularly as it would apply in the Montana context. And so the natural consequence of that is, and I'm less familiar with this particular race that you're describing, but I also know the national trend, which is the flooding of money within our political system and the flooding of money within our state judiciaries. So to the extent that that may or may not be existing, I'm intuiting that it is based on your description, but that's something that we've seen in other state courts as well, and you also see it manifested in other states by television tap ads that may be critical of a particular jurist's approach in a criminal context, for example, and maybe, you know, just providing some kind of skew or taking something out of context and making it more propaganda as opposed to what was the original context of that particular decision. And so, yes, there's a practical implication of where our state judiciaries sit vis-a-vis the robust ways in which we can rely on state constitutionalism as laboratories of democracy. This is also applied on the local level and on the municipal level. It's not just in state courts. But there's a practical implication that if we take that theory all the way to its conclusion, and you also have a flood of money in politics, what does that mean? And the same thing holds true if we overly focus on state constitutionalism. For example, we would not have seen the responses by federal law, the responses by the federal government to send the National Guard to escort the young girl to desegregate her school to uphold the decision of the United States Supreme Court. So we need to have a discussion between the necessary interplay between federal rights and constitutional rights, but we would not have fought against segregation if we left it up to the states to do that. Because the natural consequence of that is that you had a certain set of elected officials who would be making those decisions within the legislature, who would be upholding their own rights and their own view. And the unique and incredible and beautiful thing about state constitutional history in Montana is the nature of the people who comprised the delegation in 1970 by design, that they could not be dual office holders, that there were more women representation there, that there were young voices at the table. And so that is really a reflection of we the people if we believe in the principles of democracy. And so I think if we follow a particular ideology and take it to its logical conclusion, it fails us, that we have to look at the natural implications and the practical implications of it as well.
Yes,
I'm happy to weigh in if you'd like, or to move to the next,
please,
whatever
please.
you all prefer.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so let me offer just a slightly different take on the question. So I understand the question to be, is it a problem if partisanship becomes part of state judicial races? And of course, to think that there would be partisanship in the legal system is both unappealing and not novel, right? Like, so, you know, no one wants to think that a case would be decided based on something other than a law. But the question, I think, in the present day is, well, compared to what, right? And so it's hard to look at the federal appointment and confirmation system and the composition of federal courts and see no politics. And so, you know, a way to think about it might be, well, what then, in a world where the nation is quite polarized and politics are difficult to escape, what might be some advantages of a state court system, and maybe some disadvantages too? You know, I think Yael has covered some of the disadvantages, but we might just also want to think about some advantages. One is that the state legal ecosystem has the advantage of being more fluid. Right? It is not the case that a state high court will issue a decision, and then that decision is just going to be the law, you know, for a generation. Because of some of the structural features that Judge Sutton mentioned, right? Most states have, almost every state has state court judges who serve for a limited amount of time. The vast majority stand for re-election, and state constitutions can be amended. And so there's just much more of a democratic churn around judicial decision making that at least allows people to stay involved with the meaning of their constitution. So that's one potential value, is that, you know, you might have something that seems touched by partisanship, but may not be forever, or may go in a different direction. And the second possible value, which I think is a major thrust of Judge Sutton's book, is the value of pluralism. So if there's going to be politics and you can't escape them, it seems to be better to have more sites of decision making to make sure that different perspectives are representative. You know, and in the most idealistic version of sort of laboratories of democracy, good ideas can sort of percolate up, and bad ideas will be discarded. That system doesn't always work perfectly, obviously. And so there's lots of, you know, problems that I think were just described, but I think it's just worth keeping in mind that there always has to be the comparative question. What would the alternative to this system of selection be? I do think, for what it's worth, that there are some ways to modify the system of judicial selection that could potentially mitigate the effects of partisanship. But I take it that was the question of that.
Yeah, and Lars.
Yeah, so I guess maybe just a third take on the question, and specifically about the partisan aspect of, you know, Montana's elections for judge currently nonpartisan, and what the risks might be for partisan elections. You know, when I was here in law school, we had a race for the Montana Supreme Court between Justice Sweet and now Judge Van Dyke, which was at the time described as the most partisan race that we had seen. And then
I think I might have written that sentence, actually.
And then a couple years after that, we had the race between Justice Sandifer and now Lieutenant Governor Juris, and that was also described.
Indeed, yes it was.
And so I think it's fair to say that these races are getting more partisan as they continue on. My dad was elected to be district court judge in Eastern Montana, and I can tell you from personal experience, campaigns are brutal. District court judges are much less brutal than the statewide campaigns themselves. But the Montana Constitutional Convention transcript has an interesting discussion of this idea of partisan judiciary or partisan elections, and it was brought on by this delegate Schlitz, I believe his last name. The interesting thing about him was that he had just lost a race to Justice John Harrison to be the Chief Justice of the Montana Supreme Court, and during his remarks, he kept talking about how John Harrison may be in the gallery listening to him talk about this issue, and so it was this very, very personal sort of discussion, and what he said and what I took away from it was how difficult it must be to run for election for an office that's nonpartisan, particularly a Supreme Court office. I think personally that's a good thing. I think that nonpartisan is so important, but when you look at the campaigns that we're currently seeing, I think you can see the difficulty. You know, aside from their methods of interpretation of statutes and constitutional principles, there's really not much else that they can say. I mean, you might say that's a good thing, but what happens in these growing indicators of partisanry in these races, you start to see slight call-outs, you start to see endorsements get more effect. And I wonder at what point we may are already becoming partisan. We know who the candidates are because of who are supporting them, who are coming out in newspapers and offering their endorsements. And are we now just sort of covering our eyes and pretending these are nonpartisan races? And is there a benefit into just calling the spade a spade and saying we're going to not have partisan races?
I'm curious if either of the other panelists have seen, this trend in other states and whether there is a benefit to clarity. Because having written stories about all of the races we've talked about, it's always like you ask the candidate anything and they're like, I stand by the principles of the Montana State Constitution. I was like, well, that's great. I'm glad you don't. I'm glad you're not saying I'm not going to listen to the Constitution. But it doesn't really help a voter decide how to vote. It's a very low information environment, right? And so, is there a benefit to having partisan clarity around these elections, even though obviously historically there have been deep concerns about that? Do other states do it like this? I guess some do, some don't. Professor Siefter, maybe you have some insight?
So the question is, what's sort of the status in other states of how high court justices are selected?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a variety, and it's more fluid than at the federal level. So, the majority of states have justices that stand for some election. In states that have just a straight statewide election as the method, there are some that are nonpartisan and some that are partisan. Partisan just meaning that there is, a party designation next to the candidate's name on the ballot. And then, as maybe you all well know, there's a bunch of states that follow something that's often referred to as the Missouri Plan, where there's a nominating commission. I understand this has been, subject to some change in a number of states, but there's a nominating commission, there's an appointment, and then that person stands for a potential election. And then there's states that have hybrid methods, there's a couple of states that it's legislative appointment, there's some states that have gubernatorial appointment, although as Judge Sutton said, some of those have a mandatory retirement age, so only Rhode Island has appointment followed by tenure. I think it's a little bit of a sort of law professor comment, but every system comes with trade-offs. And I think that your question hits upon some of them. It's possible that partisan designations lead to higher information voters, which is generally a good thing, but it's also possible that the partisanship invites sort of further rancor and the type of advertising that's really corrosive rather than educational. It's also possible, though, to have no letter next to your name and still have that kind of advertising and animosity. So it's not clear that there is a perfect system or that some of the pathologies you're describing are a function of the system as opposed to just a function of what people perceive to be the politics and the stakes that are on the table. There are states, folks who think that it makes a difference. Ohio is a state that recently switched from a nonpartisan to partisan election system, and I believe this is the first year that those judges will run with a letter next to their name, so sort of like a real-life experiment. You can look at, whether that led to better information or whether it just led to sort of more divisiveness.
I also want to invite audience members if there are questions that you can. There's already a question. All right. I'm sorry, I just want to make things difficult for Blake to make him do 6 things at the same time.
So we'll try this. Can you speak loudly? We might just try that out right now.
Sure. And then I can repeat it so that everyone hears it.
Okay, my question is hopefully going to soothe my worries, or the answers may soothe my worries or make them worse. With regard to the legislature's role in determining parameters for voters and what is an undue burden on the right to vote, what role does the legislature's intent have to play in either the lower courts or the Montana Supreme Court's consideration of the draft of legislation that has been passed in Montana in the last 3 years? And my kerfuffle. Having seen the influence of the American Legislative Exchange Council in the Montana legislature from the 1990s on, and given that we have an activist attorney general, how can I be assured that this isn't an intentional kerfuffle set up to paint the Montana judiciary as something that it isn't, so that our activist attorney general and the various lieutenant generals, he's appointed a lot of them, so I'm not surprised he had to go to Crowley Fleck to get some assistance. But it seems to me it's a setup. Make that notion go away. Help me lose my paranoia.
I'm assuming.
I know it's.
That seems like it's directed.
I wish that there was a way to. First question, legislative intent. There's a pending case, and I will just say that generally, in the equal protection, in certain types of equal protection claims, legislative intent does become relevant according to Montana case law. So that would be to your first question. To your second question, I think it's the more pointed one. My personal belief is that we are in dire need of voter education. My comment on judicial review earlier and the connection between judicial review and judicial selection was meant in the context of the more that we are forced to rely on the Supreme Court to protect what we have come to understand as the Montana way of life, the more scrutiny those justices are under during their selection processes. And I was interested by Judge Sutton's discussion this morning, where he seemed to suggest that there's nothing stopping us from going out and educating citizenry of Montana and saying, these are our values, and this is how you vote when these are your values, and solving questions, solving these issues that way. And personally, I believe, I was preparing for this panel. I thought I've looked around my life. It's very hard to say what it needs to be in Montana. Still, to me, it's hard to describe that. I know what it is, but it's hard to describe that part. It's not hard for me to describe what it means to be a Montana lawyer. And when you come out of this law school, this Constitution takes on this almost ethereal entity status. And I remember sitting in front of Professor Johnson's Montana constitutional law class and leaving, going to clerk with Justice Goddard, and knowing my job was first and foremost, before I ever built down, to protect the Constitution. And my first day on the job, Justice Wheat walked in and he said, he asked a question, and I said, kind of muttered a response or stuttered, didn't really, until you're a lawyer, you pass the bar, and you have the same obligation to protect this Constitution as every lawyer in the state. I think I take that to heart. I think that every University of Montana law student and graduate does, and I want to take a lot of comfort in that.
Sorry, I was distracted by the alarm too. So, do you feel better?
No. But it was a good try. It's a good academic answer.
Oh, that's...
And a good heartfelt answer.
Academic answer? That seems hurtful. Yes?
Yeah, hi. So tremendous panel so far. Thank you guys. So some people, including myself, throw up our hands a bit about it. To the last question, throw up our hands a bit about educating voters, because people have been saying the citizenry needs to know more about what's going on for 200 years, and things only seem to be getting a little bit worse, especially social media. In 1916, for example, it's been proven that Woodrow Wilson got less votes in counties that had shark attacks, even though he had absolutely nothing to do with the shark attack. So
sure.
if well, amount of ignorance on the part of the public and what they're voting on, whether it's judges or legislators or initiatives. And how do we best constitutionally construct our government, have a constitutional order where we're going to be okay even if there's that ignorance out there?
I actually didn't get the last part. You said that we'll be okay even
though that ignorance is just always going to be out there.
You know, I think it's a tough question. So thank you.
I try not to make it easy.
We don't have full voter participation in our elections today. That's likely very true in Montana. It's certainly true across the country. So when we study, for example, infringements on the right to vote, they will infringe the right to vote of people who show up in good faith to cast their ballot. But we also have to work to enhance the voter rate for others. And I think it's an intriguing question of how we generate education and excitement among individuals who may not be interested in politics, right? There's a certain type of person that comes to law school. Generally, they're interested in politics, not always. But that applies across our population. It also applies to individuals who don't pursue education for one reason or another. So how do we engage the larger public? And how do we engage those who are turned off by the unprecedented polarization of our political environment, that their decision is to opt out as a result of the extreme rhetoric, the extreme polarization in our society today? And I think that this is a question that relates to boosting access to information, expanding access to economic stability, expanding access to education, that all of these other areas that are focused on having a healthy republic, if we can keep it, actually helps to preserve the democratic society itself and the participation in the democratic society. I also, I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Professor Siefter.
Yeah, pardon me, I'm happy to jump in with a few additional thoughts. So I'll accept the sort of assertion of the question that there's never going to be perfect information. And so a question to work from is, well, how do you improve information, and then also how do you channel that information to the voting process? So on first, there's a lot of really big picture questions that your question implicates about the role of social media and its possible regulation, about the sort of structure of the news industry in ways that might better preserve a role for local and state level media outlets, which are crucial. But those are kind of loftier questions, maybe beyond the scope of our panel, although actually maybe we have just the perfect moderator to opine on that. But the other piece of it that's really concrete and sort of belongs in the room that you're sitting in is that I think law schools can do a better job impressing on students the importance of understanding state institutions and caring about them. I think many state bars could do a better job of not being so federally oriented and of really having like a section and regular programming on what's going on in the state court system. Some state bars already do an excellent job of that. And I think that, we then, Judge Sutton, has been really an exceptional example, but also the exceptional example of someone who brings ideas about the importance of state courts and state institutions into more of the popular mindset. I think we could do much, much more of that. I know Professor Johnstone has done a great job teaching and writing a book on Montana constitutional law. I think there should be more of that. I wish there were more of it in other states. So that's on the question of sort of like, how do we create community and dialogue and understanding around state level being every bit as important as federal? Because if you think about it, there are a lot of people who have a lot of opinions about what's going on with, say, the presidency. There are just fewer people who are really in the weeds of what's going on at their state court. But really, it's the state level decision making that's going to impact impact more of our lives. And so I think we should always be thinking about how we can build more conversation and more understanding and reach across more divides, just be talking about what's going on in the institutions that are closer to home. The second thing is, there are political scientists, not me, but there are people who study ways to improve turnout, ways to improve information, ways to inform voters of things. Just to take one example, the timing of elections affects turnout and therefore affects the level of information that a voter is going to have, or how often people are going to vote. And so, sort of strategizing or not strategizing, but just as a general principle, having things on the general ballot as opposed to, in specials or local turnout elections can be one way, for example, with ballot initiatives, to ensure that you're getting a, rough approximation of the political community. Never perfect, always striving for better, but having sort of strategic and timed ballot initiatives is just one example of something that I think is, calls into question how informed vote really was.
Lars.
I think Professor Siefter is really great points, as does Professor Bromberg. To answer your question, my take would be it's the importance of the separation of powers. I litigated the case on behalf of some legislators challenging the June Forte administration's ability to appoint justices to vacancies post Senate Bill 140, which is another law that came out of that session. And in my view, the exercise, the delegation of that power by the legislature to the executive violated Montana's separation of powers provision, which is actually, I don't know if it's unique, but it's an interesting provision because it goes a little bit more than just saying there's an executive, judicial, and legislative power. Turns out I disagree and agree with that. But I think that those are the concerns that we need to make sure that we continue to evaluate.
Yes.
I may be the only lawyer in the room, or non-lawyer in the room, so this could be.
There's me. Hi. Good to see you.
So this may be a dumb question, but I am wondering if the right to vote doesn't deserve special protection, because when I think of the other rights, if I don't like the fact that my bodily autonomy has been taken away by some court decision, or if I don't like that capital punishment is happening, I can vote for people who will change that. And I can vote for people that I think will create legislation here that might change that. But if you take away my right to vote, I can't vote to change that. So is there any special protection for that particular right, especially when it takes away the rights of particular groups of people?
Yes. The right to vote is fundamental in our society. There's a great Supreme Court case, if you know, which says it's preservative. It's exactly what you just indicated, which is that the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. If you do not have the right to vote, you cannot exercise your ability to influence the other rights and infringements thereupon. And as a result, the right to vote is considered fundamental and recognized as fundamental, both with respect to federal law and also by various state laws. And so that's why we start to begin this kind of dance around what tiers of review that are applied to different types of restrictions that are implemented. You don't see that type of discourse as readily when you're studying infringements of other rights. You will have tiers of review, but for example, under the tiers of review, you have protection of certain classifications, such as race, gender, age, etc. And then you also have a separate analysis that applies to the type of right at issue that you're discussing. And that's where the fundamental right to vote is uniformly. I don't ever see a case decided. I haven't seen a case
question, and it's absolutely correct that everything else rests in democracy on the right to vote. And it's true that both federal and state courts have said, as Yael said, that it's a fundamental right? It's a core right that deserves the strongest form of protection. But in recent years, the federal courts have not done much to actually protect it. And you can see that in a number of different lines of Supreme Court decision making. And it's something that makes state constitutions and state courts all the more important. So state constitutions, as I've said, expressly protect the right to vote. They do so in ways that are often more protective than the federal. They have the flexibility in their jurisprudence to make that meaningful. And just to take one example, although I take it not really the center point of this panel or of your question, is when it comes to extreme partisan gerrymandering. The United States Supreme Court basically said, we're not condoning it, but we're not going to decide the question. But state courts and state constitutions, they can do that. It looks like some of them are already doing that. So there's a lot of pressure that the system is putting on state courts and state constitutions to protect that fundamental right to vote. And, the democracy principle on many of the provisions that I alluded to are sort of the vocabulary or provide a kind of toolkit for operationalizing that.
Lars, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that was...
You covered it, Art.
I would just say it's worth noting that in the argument, I think it was yesterday, before Judge Moses over the various challenges to laws restricting the right to vote, the state, through the Attorney General's office, raised this ISL theory that Judge Sutton talked about, and I talked about, which basically says the legislature takes a decision. It doesn't have to be bound to the Constitution when it restricts the right to vote. And I guess my question is a follow-up to Mary Mo's question. Why are we spending all this time justifying restrictions on voting when we should be talking about making it easier for people to vote? That's how people exercise their right of self-governance. It's through the vote. Why do we have voting? Why do we have polls on Tuesday? Let's have them over a weekend. Have them for a week. Make it easier for people to vote, not harder for people to vote.
Can I jump?
Yes, you may.
I think that we should also be proud in Montana of the ways in which we do make it easier to vote here. In many states, we have an open registration period up until currently, in the outcome of this lawsuit election. We have early voting, which means you can go in and vote in the period before an election as soon as the ballots are issued. We have no excuse to absentee voting. We have limited ID requirements for absentee voting, which means you can register to vote and vote without only the last 4 digits of your social security number. And so I hear the comment, Justice Nelson, and I appreciate it. I think as a policy perspective, we need to, and I know this has been criticized already, but we need to educate voters and get them to agree.
Yeah, first.
And so thank you for raising your point and allowing for this kind of adjusted framework, Justice Nelson. And I think that it also goes a little bit to the question that was posed earlier about voter education, is the interplay between safe and expansive voter rights and voter education. So we know, for example, that voters are paying attention to the election. There's studies that show that they're paying attention in the 2 weeks prior to the election. Why would you have a cutoff otherwise, right? We know that people have questions about the appropriate polling location for them, especially in specific protected communities. So why make it more difficult for them on election day, as another example? And so the question begs, why are we talking about the restrictions and not about the expansive mechanisms? And there are several expansive mechanisms that allow access. And we also know that we have safe and fair elections. And actually, through the Trump litigation, we saw that. We had over 60 courts say that this was a fair and just and accurate election, affirming that, and very little evidence suggesting otherwise. So in the face of very little proof of co-option of this right, it's a question of more voter engagement in our society. And for example, we saw the introduction of, I'll give you one example. I helped to architect a federal bill that was introduced a few months ago called the Youth Voting Rights Act. And there are certain provisions of the bill that begs the question, why are we not allowing polling places on college campuses across the country? Why are we having certain restrictions on a specific protected class? But I would like to say it's not just about that particular class, it's why are we not allowing enhanced access? Why is the framework from a restrictivist perspective as opposed to an expansionist perspective? And what can we learn from other countries about the way in which they administer their societies to boost? We are below, in terms of gender parity and representation in our state legislatures and federal legislature, we are among the worst in the nations around that, below developing nations. In terms of the co-option of money in politics that fosters the extreme polarization and disenchantment with the political process, we are also among the worst. So given the fact that we are in a democratic crisis in America, where people still do not believe that the 2020 election was a fair and accurate count, why is the responsive from a restrictive perspective as opposed to what's needed when we're faced with these types of crises, which is a discussion about what expansion actually looks like.
Professor Siefter, do you want to add to that, or are you?
No, I think panelists have done a great job, and I know better to stand between people on their lunch.
So I am still standing here between you and your lunch. We have about 3 minutes left in the panel. There's another, there is a question. I will stop talking now and just let you answer. There are 2 questions.
It is kind of late in the session to introduce a new topic, but if we're talking about how to structure elections to get efficient results, let's say, it seems to me there should be some discussion of ranked choice voting, which is a tangent from the question of voter access, but to me it's an important question. I wonder if the panelists have any comments on ranked choice voting.
So this is actually the value of having the states as democratic as laboratories. I didn't want to just focus on the negative before, so thank you, Professor, for lifting up the positive aspects of it. It's not my intention. But ranked choice voting is a good example of that, where it actually fosters voter education, going to the prior comment, because people can actually participate, and it allows us to remove ourselves from a winner-take-all, one person against one person system, and really allows more choice in the participation. And there's different electoral structural mechanisms. Ranked choice vote is one of them. Another one, which is increasingly being studied in the United States, is looking at comparative solutions in other countries. For example, something that Australia implements, which is 100% compulsory voting, which is essentially that you're required to participate, and that there's a penalty if you don't, a light penalty, but although, so it plays again on the development, the human cognition of people just don't want to be penalized, and there's this difference between opting into a system versus opting out of the system. Just as it's the way that we can inform our democratic participation by trying to understand more about human psychology. And there are other pieces of that as well, such as what fair ballot design looks like and how that influences voters' choices and voters' understanding of how candidates associate among each other, how they associate within a particular party that's endorsing them or promoting them on the ballot through slogan or through otherwise. So there are different electoral systems, structural systems that we can look to, and ranked choice voting is increasingly another option. And a nice thing about ranked choice voting is also that it removes the polarization, because the candidates actually have to be positioned in a perspective of kind of coalition building as opposed to winner takes all.
I have a hand up and I'm at time.
a positive note, during the 2021 legislature, a bill was introduced that had been worked on through the State Administration and Veterans Affairs Committee to improve the voting ability for disabled people. And the process through which that bill was developed included all of the advocates from the disabled community, as well as election officials, as well as Democrats, as well as Republicans. The bill came through, it was highly supported, and it addressed a lot of the barriers to voting for disabled people in Montana, and that bill passed and is now law.